coherent as I can. Um, Thank you so much, Stephen, for the introduction. What I thought I would do today is just give you a little bit of context to the chapter you all read. The chapter is chapter 6 from a book that I just finished writing, which was an immensely uphill task given the news and the state of the world. But one must do one must do what one has to do. So the book is done, and the sixth chapter of the book that you all read deals with the period between 1916 and 1926, around the life of a cooperative society that's formed in this place called Naugab. So I'll kind of situate the place. It's in contemporary Bangladesh. It's actually in the kind of northwestern corner of Bangladesh. So I'll kind of situate it with a couple of maps, but before I do that, let me just say a little bit about the book. So I'll just share my screen. Um, let's see this one. And then I'll just switch to, there we go. Can everyone see the slide?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so the the way the book is framed is around the word pursuits or pursuing, and that's the subtitle of the paper that Stephen shared with you all. The larger idea of the book revolves around the word pursuits, where I'm trying to basically situate the creative and ordinary pursuits of leisure and life around the cannabis plant among ordinary people in the long 19th century in South Asia against the kind of revenue pursuit of the British Empire in the same area and time period. So there's a way in which the British Empire's pursuit of the plant in its many forms repeatedly clashes against epistemes and ways of knowing and making meaning of the plant that exist among ordinary people. And each chapter of the book captures one side of this contestation or one side of this clash. So the one you read is a kind of contending set of is kind of dis kind of reveals a kind of contending set of politics around how to manage ganja production. What is the relationship between ganja cultivators and the British Empire? And how does it come to be that the ganja peasant in a certain part of South Asia emerges as a prosperous peasant while everyone else is suffering in the interwar period, especially after the global kind of credit crunch of the First World War. So that's kind of that's chapter 6, but every other chapter essentially manifests one contestation between ordinary pursuits and imperial pursuits. So before I talk about pursuits, what I wanted to situate is just one word and its relationship to a corresponding word. The word is ganja, which like everyone knows. It's popular in the Caribbean. It's popular in the English language. And ganja just means weed. Like basically, it's cannabis. But the argument I'm making is that ganja actually is one among many other nouns across South Asian languages, where each noun is a conjugated noun, which derives from different Sanskritic, like linguistic strategies, essentially, to combine the meaning of the intended effect of intoxication through a mix of the recipe, the social relation, and context. So certain words mean things uh, in certain contexts. So, for example, a word like chabuk, which if one literally read it, it means a whip. Okay, so literally like whipping someone, so a whip. But that's a word almost synonymous to ganja, but the word doesn't mean ganja. It means the effect one has, which is like feeling like a whip or feeling like one is whipped when you consume ganja after drinking alcohol, for example. So you drink wine and then you consume or you smoke ganja. The effect is like being whipped or getting a whip. So the word whip literally also means ganja, but then the way one would know the difference is by the language domain in which these meanings circulate, right? They don't make sense if one just writes ganja and whip next to each other in a table, which is what British officers were trained to do. They were like, let's find all the synonyms for the thing that we are trying to tax. And they would find synonyms like this, but the synonyms wouldn't actually make sense without the larger world. So, ganja as a noun in South Asia only makes sense in relationship to other meanings over and above or beyond the plant itself. And then there's a corresponding word that I want to just kind of share, which is ganja khor, Khor. And ganja khor today is is a pejorative word, like it's not a good word. You say it to refer to someone who's essentially too addicted. But the long 19th century is the period where this addict is produced actually, because most people who are consuming ganja are doing so in a world of knowledge where people know the effects, and they know that there is some amount of discernment that goes into what ganja you consume on what event, with who must surround you for consuming ganja in a certain way. So all of that context in the long 19th century that exists over time gets erased with mostly nationalism, but also kind of elite respectability politics, discourses of health and addiction. All of that happens in the 1920s and 30s also. But I kind of want to recuperate the word ganja khor from its relative, condescension that has been sort of heaped upon it. I do want to kind of extract it and situate it in relationship to the plant, because the user of the plant, ganjakhor literally means someone who consumes or uses the plant or is intimate with the plant. It's a word that derives from Persian. I want to kind of recuperate its role and see what it can teach us about the history of the plant. So that's also something that I'm doing throughout the book. So I wanted to kind of situate these two so that, just to give you a sense of everything else that I'll talk about, in the 19th century, there were many people who were intimate with the plant or used the plant in many ways, who would today we would consider them in pejorative lenses. Like we would consider them not respectable. But in the 19th century, they were an example of prosperous peasantry and also ganja khor. Even if they didn't consume ganja, they dealt in ganja. Okay, so I want to kind of just introduce these two terms, and then what I'll do today is, you all read the chapter. So what I'll do today is I'll show you a bunch of maps and photographs to give you a visual sense of who is it that I'm talking about in the chapter. So all the in the chapter you'll see Gandhi, and you'll see, the interwar period, like all of that is playing out. But I want to kind of give you visual representations of what that looked like. Okay, so let's just begin very quickly with mapping exercises. So this map on your screen, for example, is one I like to show a lot. Um, Thambisa has actually chaired many panels where I've presented this map. I really like this map. It's a map that shows the incidence of revenue uh, from ganja on population. So the darkest green on this map, it's the eastern corner of British India. The darkest green is where the revenue, like 1 rupee of revenue, can be raised from between 1 to 20 consumers. And the lightest shaded green on the map is 1 rupee of revenue can be essentially extracted from between 81 to 100 consumers. So more consumers to raise 1 rupee, and least consumers to kind of like drain 1 rupee is the kind of ratio in the map. So you see that in the gradient, the color gradient of darkness to lightness of green. And these are the kinds of maps that are produced to kind of exemplify the British Empire's pursuit of ganja. Okay. And on the other end, I want to show you a map that I made with one of my colleagues, which is this one. And this map also has an interesting kind of invitation behind it. So this is a map that I and my colleague made. Uh, on the upper end of the map, you will see the modern nation state boundaries of India and Bangladesh. And those boundaries are shaped by the Radcliffe Line, which is drawn during the partition of British India to separate India from East Pakistan. and it's an it's a well-known, violent, overwhelming process that has a kind of long history that like so many people write about. But what I'm trying to do here is with the map, the inset shows you kind of where it is, right? And I'm acknowledging the nation state boundary. At the same time as this, if you the zoomed in version, the larger version of the map is actually trying to emphasize the relationship between towns and rivers, irrespective, kind of a little bit irrespective of the national boundary there, because the towns and the rivers around Nauga. So here is the place that I'm talking about, right in the center of the map. And Nauga sits on a river called the Choto Jamuna, the Little Yamuna, basically. And the Little Yamuna is part of a network of 3 to 4 rivers. And it sits in a kind of upland tract. So it's kind of buffeted on either side by forests, which over the long 19th century are cleared out. And that's where farming begins. The soil is really rich. There's a range of British imperial policies in other parts of Bengal actually cause peasant displacement, and they come and settle upland in this kind of tiny corner between the rivers, and that's where ganja first, like the large scale ganja manufacturing that I write about, begins to happen. And this place is what sends all of its ganja to the rest of British India on the other side of the Padma River. So the southern boundary on this map, which is the Padma River, is the actual real boundary because the river is what is used for trade. So I'm trying to kind of capture not so much the lines drawn on land, but more so the relationship between the peasants and the rivers that shape ganja trade. So just to kind of give you a sense of where Nauga sits today and what its relationship was, there are more. There's actually a bigger map that I use in the book that kind of extends this argument a little bit more. But I won't go there for now. I just wanted to kind of situate where Nauga is, and what I'm going to do now is give you sort of a history of the place through pictures. Okay, so the first one I want to show, this is from 1894 on your screen, and what you'll see here is ganja harvesting and flattening out ganja and kind of shredding the ganja from the branch that's happening in open field. And in the background, if you see my cursor, you'll see small huts all the way in the background of the picture. And these are temporary structures that are built, and they're called chators. Chator literally means manufacturing yard. So these are basically manufacturing yards where indigenous workers work with Hindu and Muslim cultivators and under their direction in 5 member gangs. So 5-person work gangs. That's the kind of 19th century language. And each group of 5 is hired seasonally to shred the ganja off the leaf. Okay, so this is one of the first pictures taken of ganja cultivation in 1893. The man on the left is an excise sub inspector. So he's a policeman with a very temporary contract. Okay, so he actually has very little incentive to police very well. He's kind of there to make as much money as he can. That's an excise sub inspector on the left, and he's kind of accompanying the photographer around the cultivation tract. So this is the one of the earliest pictures. And then I want to contrast this with 2017. This is the building of the Nauga Ganja Cultivators' Cooperative Society that you read about in the chapter. Okay, so if the previous picture is 1893, this is 100 and about 20 years later. This kind of large red structure with red brick is meant to echo colonial importance. Many buildings across British India were painted in red brick like this, including the British Empire's government building in Calcutta, which is called the Writers' Building. Also looks like this is big, large, red painted, large brick structures. Um, and here, the society, when it built this office, is really trying to kind of emphasize its role in the British Empire or emphasize its peasant prosperity. So kind of digging its heels down. So I want to show you a few pictures of what Nauga looks like. The story you read between 1916 and 26 in the chapter. I want to show you what it looks like today. And these pictures, I've actually never shared them, honestly, because I took them while on research, but you can't actually put many pictures like this in a book. Okay, so I thought this would be my way to kind of introduce the chapter. So this is the building today. You can see two men kind of lounging in the front. The offices are closed. This is the record room where they kept all of their ganja cultivation records. The record room is closed and sealed. All their records are lost. So for me, writing this book was even more of an uphill task. I basically had to go everywhere to find everything that I could on them. Um, the little plaque on the wall there announces the formation of this building in 1919, which is 3 years into the period of the chapter that you read. This is the building from the back. It also has a small warehouse attached to it. So there are multiple warehouses that coordinated ganja production in the area. And then this is the bridge. I'm standing on the bridge. This is the bridge that's on the river. And all of these encampments on the right of the river that you can see, these are all built from ganja money. So ganja actually completely transforms the kind of urban landscape or semi-urban landscape of this one town and its neighboring region. So this is a map that this is a bridge that's built, and the bridge is called Lytton Bridge. It's named in honor of Lord Lytton, who was the Governor General of British Bengal. Um, this is the mosque in the center of the town that is also built with ganja money, which many self respecting Muslims in Nauga will tell you they're very proud of. Many others are not happy about it at all. But this point of contention is physically manifested in the brown part of the building, which is underneath the kind of outer later edition, which is white and painted white. The brown wall inside the building, everyone points to it and says that's built with ganja money, and the floors are built with ganja money, but the rest of the structure is not. Right. So in each of these discussions in Nauga, you can tell that the history of ganja cultivation, which stopped in about 1980, actually still hangs on the present. You can see it kind of invested in the buildings. Um, this is a photograph of kind of decrepit, ruined archival holdings of the Ganja Cultivator Society. You can see a lot of water damage and essentially documents that have been eaten by insects. So, documentary preservation has been just a big challenge. And then I want to show you some pictures which are from the 1950s, just to give you a sense of what post-partition cultivators were trying to do. This is a big lake, a pond actually built by Ganja Money also. Here are some cultivators and members of the society in the foreground. This is a visiting official from the state of East Pakistan uh, who is actually talking to peasants about better farming techniques for ganja in the 1950s. This is about 1955. And you can see a man holding a transistor radio on his left. He's like one of those assistants to the bureaucrat, the man from the civil service. And he's playing what are agricultural extension programs on radio meant to tell farmers how to grow their crops better. It's a very key part of agrarian modernization schemes in nation state planning that emerge in the post decolonized and after formal decolonization in many countries in the mid 20th century. And then here is a kind of dignitary from the state visiting and speaking to ganja cultivators in 1955. Um, this is a board meeting. You can see everyone kind of huddled together, sitting around a big table. A board meeting of the Ganja Cultivators Cooperative Society. Photographs like this from the 1950s, where you can see the halls of the annual general meeting. They're very rare, but the membership of the society had fallen to about 100 to 300 members anywhere in the 1950s from a peak of about 6,000 in the 1920s. So late 1920s, 30s, like it really kind of peaked at that point, and then after that, dipped consistently all the way down to about 100 to 150. So you can see that kind of shrinkage in the photographs. This is the board, and here are some other members of the board in I think 1959, kind of proudly standing in front of the offices that you just saw. You saw my photograph from 2017, but this is from I think 1959, where they're standing in front of the Cooperative Society building. So I'm out of time, but what I thought I would do is share these images to give you all a sense of kind of where this community of ganja cultivators sits and what their larger historical kind of significance is that you kind of see in the chapter. Because the chapter, on one hand, manifests this kind of intense period of nationalist activism in the 1920s, right as the interwar period kind of kicks off. And that is also the period when cannabis becomes scheduled with the help of South Africa and India and Trinidad and Egypt, governments that are entirely invested in the idea of a British Commonwealth, in racial ideas of, and this is Smuts' government in South Africa, in racial ideas of kind of subjecthood within the British Empire. These are all of these governments essentially combine. If you know Thambisa's work, they all kind of come together to proscribe and prohibit cannabis in international law. At the same time as this minority experiment takes off in one corner of British India, that sustains itself by supplying ganja to a regional economy within British India. So many ganja products do not cross international borders, but at the same time contribute to the kind of material prosperity of peasants in this region. And the reason they're able to do that is by negotiating, as you read in the chapter, this close and fine line between what is it to be a peasant and what is it to be an imperial subject working with the crown and working with the empire in order to kind of sustain oneself in very, very trying times. That was the 1920s. Okay, so I'll stop right there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Italia. That's really terrific. So interesting. Thank you, especially for the the photographs. I think and the maps. It really helped. Um, so the usual process. You can, if you're in the room, you can show hands. If you're in the Zoom room, you can also show hands. And of course, also you can also post in the chat. Um, I see, I believe that is in fact not Galaxy A35 5G, but Dr. Nafisa Isop Sheikh. Sorry, Professor Nafisa Isop Sheikh. Nafisa.
Hi, thank you. And I'm sorry about the naming. I don't know how to do these things. It's so lovely to hear you speak, Utathya, and I have so many questions, but I know I can't put them all to you. This is really, really, really compelling stuff and a really lovely way of combining sort of a geopolitical and sort of local economic um, sort of activity.
Sorry, Nafisa, I think we lost you. Did we lose her for a sec?
Well, she's
Okay,
muted.
No, okay,
can you
now
hear
we
me?
can hear you. Yeah, go for it.
Sorry. What I was saying was that I enjoyed the discussion of this kind of ganja lexicon that seems to exist, i.e. social context in the context of the social relations and what words mean and such. And and it's very clear that underneath this, or together with it, the ganja lexicon belongs to a particular kind of moral economy. And out of this comes, I suppose, a bunch of questions. But I suppose the first big one is that you showed us a map, the one you like, the one with the varieties of green. And I noticed that that map was made in 1896-97, where all the places to, well, the regional economy to which a lot of the ganja is being sent is going through famine. That's 1896, 1897, and that's a map of ganja production. And I'm interested, I suppose, I mean, on some very abstract sort of political level, this is a kind of Amartya Sen kind of argument about famine not being about a drought or whatever. It's about, distribution. It's much more about politics, and the way in which, these agricultural areas are run. Um, and well, the thing is, the question is a very large question, but I'm wondering if there's a way you can answer it by referring to something kind of a little bit smaller. Um, these cooperatives and the way in which you describe the interactions, this kind of local committees, panchayats in some places, in other places, I think they're also called anjumans, all of these kinds of associations. Um, seem to work to mediate larger national realities in terms of, say, sort of material realities, the availability of food, and what you call sort of prosperous peasants versus not prosperous peasants. And I'd like some sense of what a prosperous peasant is. Is a prosperous peasant someone who can pay his debts, or is a prosperous peasant someone who has like some kind of large surplus and is a zamindari, a landlord, or something else? Um, and yes, I suppose the question is, by the time you get to, the early part of the 20th century, these ways of doing things, do they partly arise from this earlier moment of famine, where ganja production basically um, cannot possibly be sustained in, well, certainly not in the central provinces in Bahar, in places like that. So that's like one question, but I have like 1,000 others, but I'm not going to ask them now.
Thank you so much. Should we collect questions or should I go one by
You
one?
could go. Yeah, for now you can go.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nafisa. I want to know all your questions. Okay, so I'll quickly answer them. Uh, just to kind of go back to the question of famine. Famine looms large, well, not just right now in this moment, but also like across the book. The first reason why famine looms large is because the upland of Nauga is actually settled as a result of famine in 1770, where peasants are basically leaving the southern Bengal Delta for northern reaches, where the land to labor ratio is in the favor of cultivators. And they are clearing land in northern reaches, so kind of the parts in the map that you see here, running away, fleeing famine essentially, and clearing new land and settling there to evade paying taxes on their home land, on their home villages, which were assigned to zamindari estates. So many peasants flee taxes to then settle in Nauga, and then the ones who were ganja cultivating peasants basically shape the environment over time to produce what they produce. Now, the history of famines across the 19th century is a extremely political point in the circulation of ganja, because whether or not one can afford food or grain at this is very much in colonial calculations of whether or not one can buy ganja. So these two kind of arithmetic calculations go hand in hand. One of the most interesting outcomes of this pattern is that ganja sales go up and down in retail terms across districts in central, eastern, and northern India, even during famine time. So, one of the very interesting nationalist arguments after the cow protection movements in the 1880s and 90s is that the British Empire is looting the peasants who are going through famine by essentially allowing the circulation of ganja to happen. And therefore, this kind of emasculated figure of the lead, the title holding, revenue yielding man who heads a peasant household in all of these other parts of British India, wasting his money away on ganja, which is now enabled by the British Empire. Interestingly, I think no one's done the math on this, but someone should. I think it's worth doing. Kind of combine, but it's just a lot of statistical work. Combining peasant household incomes through famine periods, like periods otherwise designated as famine, both in the famine districts and in the non famine districts, to actually map what is the, in Amartya Sen's terms, right? What is the exchange entitlement ratio and process of homestead incomes versus licensed cannabis circulation? No one's done this work, but I think it needs to be done because it's like interesting on one hand that ganja sales don't ever end during famine. They actually sustain quite well during famine periods, even in famine districts. In non-famine districts, of course, but even in famine districts. So no one's done that work. But I think maybe one of the invitations of your question is that this is something to maybe even try on a kind of larger statistical scale, which I could maybe think about and maybe try. I don't know. Maybe, yeah, actually, I could do it. I don't know. My brain's running on a different track. But I want to come back to your question about the mediation and the question of the prosperous peasant. So the prosperous peasant, in the way that I'm using it, is very much an interwar period term. So I don't mean this in the structural sense. In a structural sense, these peasants are most of the peasants are small holding cultivators, and I kind of situate that early on in the book in chapter two. Basically, they're all what you would call small holding cultivators who own less than 2.5 acres of land. And for them, cultivating ganja is a debt servicing revenue activity. They don't consume the ganja they grow, they sell it at a wholesale rate that is favorable to them. And the earnings from that go into servicing debts that they've taken for other events that happen in the annual cycle of agriculture and peasant life. So, marrying off one's children's, the death in a family, social obligations in a cash strapped peasantry always include debts, and this is an always intergenerationally indebted peasantry, which is why the story of the cooperative cultivators cooperative is a story of breaking debt relations in many ways. And this kind of debt relations come in chapter three of the book. So the success, quote unquote, of the cultivators cooperative is really a kind of follow through on chapter three in the book. But prosperous peasant here actually is a term, is a lit English version of a term that comes out in Bengali and Hindustani at this time, which is a krishak who earns, basically like a successful krishak, which becomes the figure at the heart of the Krishak Proja Party (KPP) that wins elections against the Congress and the Muslim League in Bengal. So the Proja movement begins in the late 1920s and 30s because the Muslim League is full of zamindars who are Muslim, and they're a nobility and aristocracy, and they do not represent the poor peasant. And the poor peasant is the one who has managed to earn from jute, sugarcane, and in this case ganja, and each crop follows a different timeline. So the poor peasants who become prosperous from jute happens in the pre 1914 period. The ganja peasants who become prosperous happens 1919 and after. Sugarcane kind of goes up and down. So in very structural terms, these are what you would call cash strapped, intergenerationally indebted small holding homesteads who employ seasonally circulating labor, both Hindu and Muslim. Whereas in very contextual terms, they become materially prosperous right after 1920, like 1920 and after. I don't know if that answers the question, but the cooperative society mediates exactly what you're talking about, becomes the site of mediation between what the empire wants, which is, basically the empire doesn't want ganja consumers thirsting for ganja everywhere in British India, and because they have suppressed ganja cultivation in other parts of India, this little, ganja cultivating tract becomes extremely important because they now can demand and bargain for monopoly power. So they can basically say, if you don't want people desirous of ganja anywhere, just let us have the monopoly and build profit from it. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of the compressed version. And I will think about your point about famine and non-famine, kind of statistically mapping an Amartya Sen question somewhere in the future.
Well, that's a very interesting answer. And if depending on how many other people have questions, I'd like to come back at some point.
That's great. So there was a question from Basitsane. Basi, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. I'm in the middle of my PhD and it's very, hello?
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. Just wondering about the software you used for recreating that map. I think it was in your second or third slide.
Thank you so much for that question. That speaks to a lot of emotional pain I have endured. So, so the I use QGIS,
Oh,
the open source version of ArcGIS because in general I like nearly 99% of open source free software that's out there. But one of the challenges of using QGIS is that QGIS downloads data from Google. And you can also get map data that is provided by nation state governments, basically, who've done map surveys.
mm,
So if you wanted to make a map with QGIS, you could totally download openly available data
mm-hmm.
of the coordinates of maps and lakes, rivers, all of like those what are essentially large Excel sheets pumped into small files. You can actually plug all of that into QGIS, and then QGIS will build the map. But what it will look like is what maybe Google Maps might look like on your phone,
Right.
but just a
Yes.
reduced
Yeah.
version. So what you
Okay.
then have to do is what is critical, which is you then have to kind of freeze the map in QGIS. I forget the technical term, and then you have to delete data points individually, and it's very painful and time consuming. But this map is the result of deleting a whole range of other data. For example, district boundaries, road networks,
Mm,
railway stations. So if you delete all of that, what's left is a very light map that is just showing what you needed to show in relationship to the story that you're telling,
yes.
and it takes hours. But if you really want to do it, I would say the end result is maybe it's satisfying. So
Okay.
that's how I did it.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful.
Yeah, wow. Great. I'm gonna, at least for now, jump in, and abuse my privileges. Let me put my camera on. Is my camera on? I don't know. No, it's on. Yeah. Um, geez, so interesting and so exciting. I again also just so many possible directions the questions might go in. The one bit was, you talked about, I think it'd be really interesting for all of us and maybe especially our postgraduates to talk about your archive problem, because I'm sure you went to the building that you showed us, the cooperative building, and in the hope that there would in fact be a whole archive there. And it looks like there was some, but actually you said it was destroyed in many ways. So just hearing about, how you addressed that problem and maybe what, the ways in which that was both a challenge, but also, maybe it made the project even better in some ways. Or certainly, made it different. That would be really interesting. You mentioned a lot petitions, and made me wonder about kind of, you're talking about mostly relatively small hold kind of peasants. So, what the levels of literacy in the area at this time. There was some stuff, really interesting stuff about the kind of languages of appeal that were being used, including, of course, the kind of classic language of appeal within the empire. And it may be a kind of third or whichever one I'm on point, which is how do you think this changes? This story changes our view of colonialism, certainly in, of course, this part of South Asia, but maybe even more broadly. I mean, from my sense of some of this literature, which I know I have a very small sense of, but I do have some sense of the South Asia literature. But obviously, mostly via Africa. Of course, there's all sorts of stuff here about the kind of importance of intermediaries, and in fact, that one of the things which we know was important in the kind of intellectual history of of colonialism, certainly coming out of the 19th century, was actually to eliminate the intermediaries and in some ways in a paternalistic fashion to protect sort of imperial subjects from them and from so-called usury, right? But also incredible agency and energy from below too. And also a kind of what Fred Cooper and others have called a kind of late colonial developmentalism, actually, in some ways. That's already present in the interwar period that you're talking about in terms of the kind of public infrastructure that you're saying comes from this cooperative and its monopoly. So yeah, really very, very interesting. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I think the last two questions are the ones that they weigh the most on me. So maybe I'll spend more time on those. I'll quickly go through the first and the second. So the archive problem is a big one, uh, because of course the archives in the building were destroyed over time, and it's very interesting to hear members of the society now, or once members, deal with what is, you know, a kind of historical amnesia that has set in after 1981, really. Because over time, as Bangladesh, the nation state took loans from the International Monetary Fund and USAID and other places, they all came with conditions to kind of suppress all drugs and so on and so forth. So there is a kind of, in the generation that is their children or grandchildren, some have a kind of knowledge of what ganja used to be in the region, but others have a certain sense of shame associated also with certain kinds of family past. So there is a kind of a malaise around preserving Nauga's history in general that exists, and the damage to the building is emblematic of the falling out of favor with governments that has happened to what families that used to be ganja cultivating families. And so that's very interesting to kind of observe. I did not have easy, straightforward archives. So I sort of built my archival base in a way by looking at material that was sent over to Dhaka and Calcutta and Murshidabad, so some of the bigger cities where documents would be sent over, and officers who were once posted to Nauga, then in their second or third appointments, wrote kind of memoirs, or sort of in a memorizing fashion what they had done before. So there is a way in which traces, I had to find traces through other traces, which becomes sort of the basis. And then a lot of the statistical data produced comes from cooperative department records, where the society would get a small paragraph in every annual report, and a journal of cooperative research where, you know, their news would pop up. So that's kind of the archival base of the chapter. The archival base of the book is even kind of is messier in some way, but kind of threaded together to make sense. So that's how I solved the archival problem. It's really my general method of writing is very much narrative social history. So all narrative social history is about sort of building and constructing and contrasting different archives. So this is very much sort of par for the course, like textbook kind of work, I think. To go to your question about petitions, this to me is very fascinating because uh, many people here are not literate. Many ganja cultivators are not literate actually, but the what starts happening in the 1910s, 1900s and 1910s really, is the repeated fluctuation in prices affects both large uh, land-holding ganja cultivators, who are about 5% of all ganja cultivators, and small-holding ganja cultivators, who are the vast majority. And there is a kind of unity in appealing to the state for what today one might think of as protective minimum prices, where they really like try to petition the state to give them guaranteed rates that are wholesale prices. And the way they do it is by going to the Ganja Supervisor's Office, which is an office that's built in Nauga in 1855. And that's the kind of central distributory mechanism for all information on ganja it's not a very powerful office by any means, because in another one of Fred Cooper's arguments, the state that is built by really underfunding its parts. This is very much a textbook example of that. There is an office, but no one is well paid in it. So the way statistics circulate out of that office, or even petitions circulate out of that office, is very much due to convenience. But nonetheless, it is an important archive. So in these moments, one can see petitions becoming very important, where the local ganja supervisor receives a lot of input, writes them down, some written, some not, writes them down, and that kind of becomes the archival basis for some of my analysis. Let me just come to the last two, which is, like I said, it's the thing that just always weighs on me, right? Like, because with so much of narrative social history, the question I always fall back on is it that I love this story, or just have sat with it for so long that I'm writing it, or does it actually change something? And the question of how it changes our view of colonialism, the one that I've kind of finally made peace with in my mind, I think, is that colonialism is very much an interspecies enterprise, or a multi-species enterprise. But humans, plants, animals, everyone, the relations between these things are subject to colonialism. Colonialism doesn't just stop at the human. So there is very much that argument in much of the literature now. But I think there is something to a more materialist analysis of how certain species shape what colonialism looks like. So in this case, it's ganja. And the reason this whole chapter looks like this, or the reason the book is kind of following ganja in particular, is because ganja has a very specific materiality, where the plant is very sensitive. To produce the plant with maximum intoxicating power, it needs a lot of care. It needs de-weeding, consistent amounts of kind of artisanal garden variety labor. Um, you have to restrict the plant's sexual reproduction to avoid seeds, the formation of seeds in the plant, and kind of massage its ability to produce resin to its maximum. And because that has its unique agricultural rhythm, and kind of like rhythm of care involved in the nursery, the sapling nursery for saplings, the field, the farm, the homestead, this material constellation of sites and spaces that makes ganja so sensitive and particular invites a certain kind of and shapes a certain kind of colonialism, where even if the British Empire wanted to expand revenues from ganja, they couldn't, because it's not as straightforward as opium, and and the taste for ganja isn't as widespread. Like, there is a way taste matters to the consumer. It's not all just an intoxicant, and in doing so, colonialism then has to shape itself into the social relations of the plant, not so much the desires of the colonizer. The desires of the colonizer play, yes, but it is not limited. Like, it is quite limited, in fact, in the way that it shapes up. So I think that's the argument about how it changes what we understand as colonialism. Because over time, I've realized I do not want to take the white man in the file at face value on anything, right? So, like, in the colonies, why must I assume that the person writing the report knows anything at all? And I think what this has allowed me to do is to basically say what they know at all is really in response to how the plant and social relations around it have shaped up. So it's a way of sort of limiting the kind of imperial voice in the archive for me, I think. And then to the last point about saving the peasant from the usurious indigenous money lender and so on. I think this is very much the cooperative society's purchase with the colonial state. I think the colonial state finally sees a way to not have large money lenders who are also ganja cultivators. Many families do both. They lend money and cultivate ganja, and also speculate in futures, in prices in the market. So this is finally the colonial state is like, okay, if you form a cooperative, we will prohibit all money lending, and you can then kind of gain a reserve fund from subscriptions of peasants who become money lenders. So it's a way of disciplining the large landholder also. And then we'll give you a monopoly right. So the monopoly award of the colonial state, which basically means you are the only seller of cannabis, buyer and seller of cannabis, basically, and we'll suppress it everywhere else, is built on the small cultivators collectively resisting the large money lender. So it is the way I put it in the chapter is a reconstitution of intergenerational debt relations. And this is precisely the point on which a colonial functionary and a small peasant can be on the same page, which is let us finally agree that the usurious money lender, who some of whom are also ganja cultivators, are the problem, and they have to be managed, and we manage them through a kind of uh, temporary intersection of interests, which becomes the cooperative society. I see Hambisa's hand up, so I'll stop. I
Yeah,
can
yeah,
go
no,
on.
that's an excellent answer. And I know Nafisa's rearing to ask another question, but in the interest of democracy and maybe not household happiness, Tembisa.
Thank you.
Democracy is overrated.
My turn, Mafisa. Um, Thanks, Utathya. You know, I'm a big fan of your work, and this is just one of the reasons for that is that you have a way of bringing in lots of layered analysis. And I've had the pleasure of reading your manuscript, so I know that your first chapter sort of focuses on the botanical nature and the gendered nature of the plant, and sort of moves almost cinematically moves out into a larger context. And I just love that approach. I just wanted to raise an issue that kind of brings it home a little bit to South Africa. At the moment, the South African government is actively pursuing cannabis. It's pursuing it for revenue. It's also at the same time continuing to try to prohibit. It's a real confusion at the moment. They've assented to a cannabis bill, which allows for the private use and consumption of cannabis by anyone for any purpose, but with the stipulation that nobody is allowed to buy or trade or sell cannabis. So there's this assumption that people are going to cultivate their own cannabis. And this has sort of this has created a situation where there's quite a lot of confusion, and people taking the gap and industries forming, and the government is sort of pursuing two different projects at the moment. Um, what I wondered is if you would be able to kind of move forward in time with your own project and speak to the issue of regulation, because so much of what you're writing about involves, the quantifications of the plant, and both in terms of finances, but also in the products itself. Now we have the issue of alkaloids and the molecular level of the plant and different kinds of products that are being promoted. And I wonder, like, what is it even possible um, for a government to try to regulate as well as promote an economy of cannabis at the moment that I suppose takes producers into account as well as large pharmaceutical companies? If you could just briefly speak to your own sort of political take on those issues, I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much for all your comments on all my work. Just generally, I'm incredibly grateful and just, yes, thank you. Cannot quite put it into words, but very, very grateful. Also very grateful for this question. I think this question speaks to, I think it is a political question, and not so much, not just political in the sense that in the sense of what institutions and governments can or can't do, but I think it's political in the sense of a very classic conceit of liberalism that we are all kind of stuck with, which is this kind of individual the individualization of the body, whether of the human or the plant. So I think one of the ways in which a lot of this alkaloid molecular analysis of biochemistry happens is by distilling intoxicant ability into very specific parts of the plant, which is very much a 19th century project also, except that there was no alkaloid chemistry there. So the argument was simply the leaf produces this kind of intoxication, the flower produces a different, and so on and so forth. And I like today, I think in today's world, it can be far more sophisticated than that. But then it uh, pivots on the other side of this equation, which is the social relations of intoxication, where intoxication produces effects only in relationship to the context of the person going through that experience. In that kind of famous example, you can put many bottles of wine in a faculty party and many bottles of wine in a student room, and they'll produce totally different effects. The same amount of intoxicant, right? So the fact that human bodies are different, each human body is so different, the fact that each human body's relationship co-evolutionarily to cannabis is also different. Each body has CB1 and CB2 receptors that can respond to cannabinoids, but not in the same way, right? Makes it very difficult for us to ever confidently say this type of cannabis product will produce this kind of intoxication, that it will not make you see hallucinations, that it will not do this or not do that, or this will be a mild effect, this would be a strong effect. Like all of these things that agro business produced cannabis commodities do, they are all essentially hopeful conjectures. They're not ever fully true. Not that anything can be, but like really identifiably correct sort of effects. So to to the question moving forward, how do I see regulation working out? I think I think there has to be some form of dialogue between the cultures of consumption and how one understands mental health, affirmative care, uh, therapeutic use, pain relief, right? These are the kinds of things where cannabis products most likely will end up. One has to have a very uh, open and kind of politically progressive discussion around these kinds of things that are essentially that are material decisions and not necessarily shaped by liberal kind of just service delivery methods of state, but actually accountable relationships that speak to health communities, speak to indigenous knowledge, speak to gender affirming care, like things like that, pain relief, questions of age and so on one hand, and on the other take into account what one might call like democratic sort of cultivation, like capitalism that can actually help small producers, because we're stuck in a binary where any agro-business approach in South Africa or Kenya or anywhere else, India and Bangladesh are thinking of the same thing. A lot of youth want to kind of tap into the global north's cannabis economy in South Asia, and it produces these desires of future prosperity that can kind of invert the global relations, where suddenly the South becomes the place to learn progressive cannabis, from. It's not so much Amsterdam, but it's really, the global South. And I think a lot of youth have these desires, and I think it's fair, but they are ultimately aiming to plug small cultivators into a world market. And without a really serious conversation about the state and its responsibility to health on one hand, and the state and its responsibility to uh, avoiding exploitation on the other, I don't know how future forward regulation might pan out. I think the part that I'm convinced about is that it cannot just reproduce this kind of classic molecular alkaloid analysis of the intoxicant. It cannot just be, here are all the products we agree with because they produce this standard set of reactions in the human body. There is no the human body here. And I think that contextual knowledge must shape lawmaking. I think it'll look different depending on the kind of local regional context where that kind of lawmaking might play out. I don't know how it answers your question, but I think it's not fully possible, but I think it is possible.
Tembisa, do you want to come back? Or?
No, it's fine. I'll let others go, but thanks a lot.
Great. So there's just I see a hand from Musa. I just wanted to read what Catherine said. Prof. Burns, thank you for this biological material and embodied and careful explanation. And I think that's well said. So Musa, and I know Nafisa's also got a question again.
Oh, thank you for giving me the floor. My question is basically, I mean, more or less a comment, pivoting from Thembisa's comment as well, because I was waiting as I don't know, maybe I'm probably the only natural scientist in the room. I might be wrong, but my background is in neuroscience, and I have been working on cannabis the last 3 years. So I appreciated the fact that the conversation was coming to a place where I could engage more with the conversation because I did see the value in terms of the economic world as well as how that translates into the context Thembisa brought up, which is the regulatory project on in South Africa, which seems to be kind of confusing because on one hand you have this conversation that is sprouted by the need to uh, open up the economic opportunities that gives many arms of the society the opportunity to participate in that. And then the other arm, you see that there's this regulation. But I'll speak from a place of personal experience because I struggled with cannabis for over a decade and it led to a serious substance use disorder for me. So I know it's more or less a personal conversation, but that is really what has inspired my work. And I said literally today, just before I joined this meeting, I am scheduled to submit my doctorate thesis in less than 3 weeks. And I'm struggling to literally comb through the internet to find literature that supports the data I have been sitting on the last 2 years, which is a data that speaks to an expansion into the biology that Utathya, if I mentioned your name correctly, is speaking to you that you have this individual diversity in terms of the genetic profiling of individuals and how they receive these drugs, and to be specific in terms of even the phytocannabinoids that our bodies engage with. And you can't really ascertain the CBD that is so-called safe. Literally, from our data, we see that at certain doses, it inhibits certain um, metabolizing enzymes that accentuates the activity of THC, which leads to the entire psychotropic activity. And when you have individuals with certain genetic markers, chances are high that they will come down with problems. So, I mean, it'll be very interesting. I know we don't probably have the whole day, but to see where that this kind of conversation has a place from the history that you speak to the economics of the plant and how that can shape the conversations that are happening right now. I know you obviously we probably don't all have the answers to these questions, but this is definitely a looming problem, especially for Africa, especially when you think about the context of addiction and the place of cannabis, and then the expansive mental health landscape and the fragility of the structures, and what that means to communities that are already uh, so to say, marginalized historically, and the place of this entire conversation for those communities and the perpetuations of this economic landscape. Sorry, I'm rambling, but I hope you're able to pick things that you can piece to speak to. But yes,
Thank you,
basically
Musa.
that.
I think it might be nice
Thank
to
you.
just do a final grouping here before you answer, if that's okay. So, Nafisa, do you still want to come back with a question?
I do, but maybe he can answer this one first. I don't want to,
Well, if you can
root the answer
succinctly
to me.
state it, if you can succinctly, sorry, state it, then we can bundle them.
Okay, because I'm known for my succinctness, happily.
Yes.
Okay, so there was, I was trying to think about my work and try to figure out how it was related to what you're doing. And then you spoke about liberalism, and that's like this big flashing light every time someone says that word. And you spoke about the way in which, one of the scholars of India really like to beat up liberalism. So the individuality of liberalism clearly is a problem, and you're talking about ganja as an interspecies, as you said, because God forbid the Anthropocene should be left to continue. But the social context of ganja and the social relations of ganja are either basically they're male, all of them. And the interesting thing is that you point out that the thing about ganja is that the revenue is used for people's social lives. And amongst those, weddings, births, deaths, inheritance, those are the things that mark prosperity and for which ganja is grown. So I suppose I want to know why it is that only male social relations come out of this when studying agrarian policy, especially with the relation to ganja. And that's for two reasons. One is, of course, Vinat Talwar Oldenburg's 2000, I think it's more than 20 years old now, the book about dowry murder. And basically, the idea that in the past, women's dowry and women's own land holdings were more substantial and women had more control over it before the famines and before these kinds of agrarian politics that you're describing happen. And that basically colonial participation in the changing agrarian landscape reshaped social relations between men and women, fathers and daughters, families with daughters and sons, husbands and wives, and the amount of power in general that women can exercise through material resources. And I'm going to be succinct, so I'm just going to sort of on the side say that women enter this particular chapter when you get to sort of the Hind Swaraj stuff, and that is like another flashing red light, because of course that's where the women come in, because by then they're all going to be Mahabharat. They're going to be mothers of the nation. They're not going to be something else. They're all going to be Brahmin, and they're all going to be women who commit sati when their husbands die. Vinayak Chaturvedi is the last thing I want to say. And I think that his works on two things. One is Peasant Pasts, which is really about how it is that the relationship between nationalists and the colonial state is about agrarian social relations, and how it is that people on the land already get to keep hold of their positions in society, and the subsequent work on Hindutva and violence are two ways in which I think that you have to complete an interspecies cycle. I'm a humanist, so somehow I think ganja is useless on its own. And I love the story that you're telling, but I think that's half a story, and there's another whole social world that comes along with this.
There we go. That was succinct, apparently.
Okay, so maybe I can answer both Musa and Nafisa's question with just not question, but sort of comments. First of all, thank you both of you, because you're both giving me the opportunity to sort of catalog what I'm saying in relationship to gender studies, feminist theory, questions of gender, feminism, queerness, and transness that actually do shape some of the arguments that I'm making. So I'll go in reverse order with Nafisa's question and then come back to Musa's point about bodies, the specificity of bodies, and how we've actually arrived at it, not just through research on substances, but also research on gender and feminist struggles that sort of shaped other things, but also shaped this one. So let me go back to start with Nafisa's question. So I don't think Ganja's world is all male, actually, not even a little bit, or male social relations. So one of the most fascinating thing about the multiple names of Ganja is that they all have a gender politics. That ganja is gendered, names for ganja are gendered in multiple ways, depending on what the context is. So when it's feminized, it's being used in certain contexts. When it is masculinized or imagined as, let's say, a male social figure like an ascetic or a teacher or an elder or something like that, it follows a different rhythm and logic. So that's kind of what I do in the early part of the book. The question about household relations and gender and the sort of what we might call the question of social reproduction and gender that revolves around the plant's own questions of gender has to do very much in an economic setup that connects the small peasant homestead that you see in this chapter, the women who are consuming goods on the basis of ganja revenue. If we look at household consumption patterns, the little data that exists from Nauga, women are actually the lead consumers. They're buying new clothes, new forms of cloth that are coming up through the river trade. They're buying jewelry in fairs. You know, they're buying food items like yogurt. Yogurt is a big one, different kinds of curd basically for family gatherings and festive relations. There's also this added element of peasant polygamy, which has a kind of unique role that I kind of discuss in chapter 2, which comes up. So, in the kind of world of scant archives, there is a world of gender relations that is erased by the figure of the title holding male cultivator that the colonial state recognizes. And what I do to kind of invert it is look at family labor and look at family homesteads and how gender relations actually are an effect of how men, women, children, brothers, sisters care for a plant in the house, in the field, and so on. So, gender is very much a product of labor. If anything, that's kind of what I'm arguing in the early part of the book, especially in Nauga. On the flip side, if we look at consumers of cannabis consumption, its most kind of heightened periods in the social calendar of India is during religious festivities, especially among heterodox Muslim communities and more orthodox kind of Hindu ones, where cannabis is either associated with Shiva worship or Durga worship in certain times of the year. So it's never a year long thing, it's only on certain days that you consume it. So it's anyway a kind of sort of regulatory method on its own. And there, women actually consume cannabis. So women in elite homes, Hindu women, consume cannabis on the 10th day of Durga worship. And in heterodox Muslim peer communities, women consume it on the day of the peer's death. So in many ways, consumption of cannabis, its social form, derives from already existing gender transformations of gender and gender relationships or gendered relationships that exist in religious communities on their own, like already existing ones. So to your point about the socialized part of or humanist socialized part of cannabis, I think there is very much that aspect to it, which to me actually undoes the presumed maleness of cannabis. It actually does bring in a question of larger forms of social forms of gender. But then where I think I depart and where I think I'm not being a humanist and I'm actually taking multi-species relations seriously is that the Hindustani and Bengali lexicon of gender is actually accommodative of gender variance. It is not a male female binary by any means. So there are all kinds of gender names for cannabis plants, which what in English would you one would consider intersex or hermaphrodite or other medicalized terms like that. We could use them if we wanted to translate, but no translation would be perfect because in Hindustani and Bengali, all these words are doing is referring to the plant, its body at different stages of growth, where sometimes the plant has flowers and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it bears seed and doesn't. Sometimes there is a lot of gender variance in the cannabis species. So sometimes the upper half of the plant is sort of biologically male and the lower half is not. Like this, what we would call gender variance in the flow of trans studies today or queer studies today actually exists in plant life. And the larger argument here is that gender variance exists in all species life. It is very much liberal modernity that we are stuck with binary forms of gender and kind of, and uh, uh, patriarchal social relations, that we're stuck with this kind of way of not being able to acknowledge gender variance. So this is, I think, where I'm taking a leaf out of the grain of feminist, queer, and trans studies to basically say, look, gender variance exists in all species. The plant has its own register for which there are Hindustani and Bengali words. We just can't translate them into a gender logic in Linnaean botany or biochemistry. So that's kind of the struggle. But this is my segue to Musa's question. And I think, Musa, to your point, first of all, can I just say I fully empathize with your challenge about trying to connect one's personal understanding of intoxication to a heavily scientific regulatory paradigm in which intoxication's effects are understood. And I think, again, here, the thing, I mean, first of all, I completely agree with you, and all the data you're sitting on is really valuable and probably needs to be out there in the world soon. I think the question of the difference of bodies and the fact that bodies are generative of theory is a gift of feminist struggles, and I think is a gift of, transnational feminism, is a gift of queer struggles, where we can see that we have to take the specificity of bodies very seriously if we have to contextualize the effects of stimulants, because otherwise, in ways in which state regulation works, especially in to go back to my point about liberalism, state regulation always assumes the plant affects the body, right? It produces a effect or a standard effect. And I think what the gift of feminist and queer struggles is that there is no the effect, that there is actually something generative, that, by which I mean bodies generate history. Both the plant and the human body generates history when it collides through intoxication, and those histories have particular elements as much as they mediate larger universal ones. So it is in the defense of the particular that one must situate data. It is in the absolute defense to kind of go back to the powerful strands of social history from the colonies, right? Like, one must defend the particular because it is where the supposedly universal actually comes aground. It is where it hits bedrock, right? Like, you have to situate uh, in very concrete bodies what certain plants can do. And that conversation, to me, has to be one where the local is taken seriously, has to be one which comes bottom up, has to be one which essentially has a different progressive politics to it. Like, it can't be a capitalism liberal mode, we understand the drug we're talking about, right? It has to be one which takes difference of bodies, difference of pain, difference of relationship to substance seriously. And I think what I'm trying to show in my work in some way is that that difference has been acknowledged in other language epistemes. If it doesn't exist in the English language in modern state regulatory frameworks, that's a different fight to have. It's a different struggle. But knowledge of the difference of bodies and its relationship or relationships between different bodies exists in other languages. And maybe this is this is where language work, socially rooted cultural history can come into play. Maybe I'm being hopeful, I don't know, can come into play, that also doesn't give in to nativism and doesn't give in to a kind of indigenous nativism, but actually accounts for the political power of contextual knowledge around difference, especially. So I think if I can sum up my answer to both Musa and Nafisa, I think, I think that the human and the plant. When I say the human and the plant, I am not only saying the human and the plant. I am very much speaking to the spirit of both of your questions, to pluralize human and plant relations, to democratize human and plant relations in the way in which we think about histories, um, of stimulants, especially plant-derived stimulants, I think.
You've given us a lot to think about. Since we technically have 6 minutes, I was wondering if you could briefly, and I know it's unfair to ask you to do this, but I know it's something you already, there's some material in the chapter already about this. Talk about anti-colonial nationalism, contending nationalisms in South Asia, in the sort of interwar period, and then obviously up towards and even after partition in relation to how this drug and also this region and its peasantry are sort of managed, for want of a better word.
Stephen, just so I understand your question or comment, so can you just say it one more time? Should I just situate it in the time
It's
period?
really so you gesture towards you talk about the way prohibitionism, and of course you've done some work, I should have said this earlier, that was published in the South African Historical Journal. Tembisa's work on this, obviously on prohibition and empire, but also prohibition and other responses too within kind of anti-colonial nationalism. So it's really about sort of pulling that thread out, which is obviously in your chapter, but I'm sure dealt with much more elsewhere.
Thank you so much. So I think the way I understand prohibitionism is kind of on one hand granular, where in South Asia a lot of prohibitionism is driven forward by nationalist Hindu, often basically Hindu chauvinist nationalism, which is kind of trying to reproduce this figure of a nationalist subject who can repress desire and is moral because the Gandhian nationalist subject, for example, can repress desire in a way the West cannot. Like the West is just its desire for violence and capital is just like unrestrained, whereas the Gandhian moral subject represses desire, disciplines the body, and so on and so forth. So that Hindu chauvinist idea of prohibition derives from that at the granular level in many parts of South Asia. It of course has its co-evil figure in the scientist, in the nationalist scientist who also kind of scientifically supports the same thing. But on the ground, there is of course the other question of household incomes, where anti-liquor politics in South Asia, especially liquor is the big one. Anti-liquor politics in South Asia is driven by women and women's movements because the household income is split repeatedly by drinking habits of the men. So there is a way in which prohibitionism finds likely and unlikely allies over the 20th century, especially after the 1890s, really, like 1900s, it kind of picks up. And this is where colonial support for intoxicant circulation gets its most of its critics. Liquor, basically, liquor is what gives colonialism its biggest critics often in terms of numbers. But I think after the First World War, we are in a different world altogether after 1919. I think the interwar period is a really important shifting point where many of the former colonies are trying to become nation states or claiming to be nations in the language of the League of Nations Charter. And as they do so, to take their seat at the table of nations, at the League of Nations, which is really a League of Empires, but the way the claim works is that we are also nations, and in our format of nationalism, we can actually, you know, be at the table where you discuss your regulations. Now, it just so happens that opium and drugs are a key point of friction between empires. The US, France, England, Britain, basically at the League of Nations, among other things, national boundaries, shipping, and so on, espionage, like there are lots of things that go on at the League of Nations in Geneva, but the big one is also opium. Opium conventions happen every year because no empire wants the other to profit off of drugs in the international arena. And the fingers are all pointed at Britain and kind of France, but also the US is leading this charge. So any prohibitionism in the colonies is automatically now mediated by concerns at the in quote unquote international level at the League of Nations through the 1920s, the 1930s even. And the turning points here are 1925 and 26, and then 1930. 25 is when the first convention is drawn up, which is a gift of Smuts, actually. And 30 is when dangerous drugs laws are passed across many British colonies, which formalize many of the things that come from 1926, the agreement in 1926, where cannabis, the whole plant in toto, is clubbed under opium. So they're all intoxicating in the same way. So there is this kind of international prohibition that clubs all plants together as dangerous drugs. And then what that does on the ground is that it limits the ability of the British Empire to make forceful arguments, because it's doing in British India is allowing drugs basically and profiting from them. So what the British Empire does is it makes an exception for British India on religious grounds by saying Hindus and Muslims have always consumed cannabis in some form or another. There's always some regulation that goes on. So we don't have to fully prohibit it. We just have to manage it through the state. And we are already managing ganja through the cooperative in Bengal. In other places, Madras and Bombay, we have small scale cultivation. Berar and the central provinces and, all the princely states, they're all under control. So it makes this kind of regional exception for British India, while other British colonies do not get very much of an exception at all. In fact, Trinidad and the Crown colonies in the Caribbean are subject to actually American pressure more than anything else. And I think by the 1940s, I think that's kind of the that's kind of the that's the last burst of any open cannabis cultivation. After that, everything that happens is either very strictly for medical research or bhang production just for the leaf, which has a kind of separate tangential history in law, because bhang is very sacred to certain groups of Hindus in South Asia. So there is a kind of a further exception to the exception made for cannabis leaf in South Asia, but takes a totally different trajectory, but very much internally in domestic politics that tries to balance international criminal prohibition with local desires for some kind of prohibition. I don't know if that answers your question, but really the interwar period is a period where so much is in flux, where people are trying to actually claim the ability to make laws for themselves against empires by claiming the language of nations. And that always brings with it a trap, which is you have to first define the nation, imagine the future national subject, speak on in its name, and yet still have enough ground that is not violent opposition to empire to seize concessions from imperialist power. So that's the context in which all of these minute changes in law and policy and kind of classification happen.
I think you've done fabulously well just based on the chapter that you shared in your presentation. We all need to get a copy of this book. And thank you so much for sharing your research with us today. It was really a fabulous seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tyler. That was fabulous.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you,
No,
Nafisa.
and
Thank
thank you
you,
for waking up
Nafisa.
so early. Get some coffee.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and asking all the questions and indulging me in my display of sepia, nostalgic sepia photographs. So
No,
thanks.
it was great. Thank you.
We
Thank
we
you,
we all
everyone.
have our particular fetishes. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Well
you.
done. Thanks for joining. Thank you.